I think especially when you're working with vulnerable populations, which I do believe addicts are kind of definitionally within that space of vulnerable populations. We do want, yeah, we do want, sunlight is the best disinfectant for us or for people to be able to see, like, do these treatments work? What is the change among the people?
And that's what you would expect in other in other fields of health, right? So if a physician is putting a person on a blood pressure medication, that there is evidence that this blood pressure medication is effective for reducing blood pressure, the doctor still has to measure that person's blood pressure and make sure the blood pressure is going down and change the treatment if it's not working, right? And that's not seen as a failure of the doctor if the first medication that was tried doesn't work, or a failure of the patient, right? This is just a part of the procedure of treating people in an evidence-based fashion.
Right. It's an iterative process.
Yeah.
And again, the Rehabilitation Wellness Inventory is a tool before and after treatment. And I know of individuals as a clinician. I know of individuals who have remained clean and sober, or have not used, who had a problem with alcohol and chose to remain abstinent, or with illicit substances, and perhaps 10 years later they will relapse. One hopes that they don't, and there are systems in place to support individuals so they don't have to. I mention that because when people are holding themselves accountable to addressing issues honestly, the issues, for example, that are referenced on the Rehabilitation Wellness Inventory, for example, I feel emotionally balanced, is a question. Well, it's more common than not when people do have relapses in addiction, it's because they're not doing the necessary work to look at those mental health issues. They may have gotten better at one point, but just as there's a concept in statistics called regression to the mean, people may resort to or habituate to ways of being that they had in the past. And so it's important to, this issue of accountability is very important because we live one day at a time.
Yeah, for a lot of people with addiction, it is like, as you're saying, it's like a daily struggle, or something that's a big part of their life. And so to have that as follow through, as like to keep going as follow through, and it's not, and as we said before, it's not just measuring the addiction, but it's measuring the whole mental well-being space within them. It does provide some level of like vision, or what you're calling accountability, some perspective, like they can have almost like an outside perspective on themselves that they don't even necessarily have to share with others if they don't want to.
Yes, you're correct. It becomes a tool that people can use at any time in their life as a way of checking in. I also want to point out, you had used the term struggling with addiction. There are moments in people's sobriety, or especially with 12-step programs, where that is no longer a struggle. In other words, the issue of alcohol or illicit substance is no longer a struggle, especially with the 12-step program, where there's a focus on looking at one's relationship with oneself, with others, and with the higher power of one's own understanding. And it's very, very common for individuals with 12-step program over time, some people sooner, some later, where they feel as if they've had this spiritual experience. And what I mean by that is they don't know why or how it's happened, but there's no longer a struggle with addiction. There may be struggles with a relationship, a spouse, a mother, a father, a brother, a coworker. Those issues may sometimes be a struggle. Why? Because we're human. and we have these struggles. But having worked in the field of addiction, one of the remarkable elements that I've seen is that there are individuals who have what they call a spiritual experience, and by a spiritual experience is something that seems as if they couldn't have done it themselves, or it seems somewhat transcendent, or it's mysterious, but it's real for them, where somehow they're no longer thinking about the alcohol. They're no longer thinking of the drugs. It's as if that obsession has been relieved, and it seems to have been given as a form of a gift.
And like it's weird because like it's like we're trying to like keep that out of psychology a little bit, but also it's also a fundamental part of a lot of people's lives and a lot of the way they see things and the way they frame.
William James was a professor of psychology at Harvard in the late 1800s. Psychology. He wasn't a professor of spirituality, he was a professor of psychology. And he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experiences. He was a psychologist that was trying to understand what were the circumstances, the conditions that seemed to be common amongst individuals who were going to have an experience which for them felt as if they were being transitioned to a different dimension. Not that their feet weren't rooted on the ground, but a good analogy would be looking at the atom. We know in the physics, an atom is a nucleus, and inside the nucleus there are protons and electrons. There are orbitals around the nucleus of electrons, and there are different levels. Well, what do the electrons do, and how does chemistry work? Electrons actually go from one level, they jump to one level to the next. That's how chemistry works, where electrons will gain energy or lose energy, and they jump to different orbitals. I'm only sharing that because that's in the physical world, and what terminology or what reference point do we have for people having an experience that's spiritual? It's as if they're being transitioned to a different level or a different orbital. That doesn't mean they're still not
industry, right? That many, especially young people, end up in rehabilitation treatment because somebody else wants them to be there, and not because they themselves are ready, right? And this is not just true of addiction, but any kind of mental health care. That if the person comes in not of their own volition, where they don't yet see a reason to change their behavior, or they're not yet ready to change their behavior, it's difficult. I mean, the classic joke is, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is one, but the light bulb has to want to change, right? Yeah. But it can be very, very heartbreaking and challenging. And parents can say, like, look, I mean, I've, how many tens of thousands of dollars have I spent on sending you to rehab after rehab after rehab, and you're still using, but the kid doesn't want to stop yet.
And that doesn't mean that one can't, because interventions sometimes do work. People get exposed when people are basically told by the courts that they need to go into this particular program. They're ordered to, and sometimes what I've seen as a clinician is that sometimes those individuals will see things and hear things that make it click, and becomes a trigger to change where they didn't initially want to. They hear something. But I've also seen individuals who were mandated by court to go to rehab programs, and they did it because they were required to do so, or because their spouse wanted them to do so, and it tended not to last until they found for themselves. And maybe where spirituality comes in is that it's a form of grace to have the desire to want to